Welcome to another episode of Paranormal, the New Normal. I am your host, as always, Jeremy, trying to bring a little normal into this world, which these days seems impossible. My guest tonight, though, I'm excited to have him because as soon as I read his bio, I had to get him on the show, especially with the main topic he's an expert on. But we'll get into that in a bit. My guest tonight is David Edward.
Hey,
David, how
Jer.
you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, sir. How are you?
Can't complain. Doing pretty good.
Good.
And I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects tonight. So, but we'll get to that in a second. And actually,
Sure.
we'll get to it right now because the first question I ask everybody on the show is, what got you into the paranormal, supernatural world?
Yeah, and as we were just talking, there's a couple ways I could answer the question. My kind of claim to fame right now is the Atlantis book, which is more alternate history than paranormal, although there's some interesting things about it. So we can talk about that. And then also, as I mentioned to you, I actually owned a house that was haunted. So I'm more than happy to talk about that as well.
Ooh, well, we'll definitely be hitting on both those subjects tonight because as someone, I live in a haunted house as well. So I am definitely interested in that part as well,
Okay.
100%. But yeah, well, my second question on the show is always, have you had any experiences? And as you just said, you lived in a haunted house, so I'm sure there's a few experiences in that situation.
Yeah, and it was, so going to with the haunted house, we had a house in a place called Central City, Colorado, which is very famous. It's just a hair west of a town called Blackhawk, which is now more famous, but Central City has the real history, and it was a mining town, so it kind of formed in the 1850s and 1860s, and the infrastructure was still pretty much what was there in its boom. Matter of fact, there's probably less infrastructure than maybe in like the 1890s because it was a gold rush town, and we bought a little house there, and there was it was very nice haunting, if you will. You would stuff would move, especially in the kitchen. Stuff would move, and then you would catch stuff out of the corner of your eye. But it was always it felt very motherly or very paternal versus threatening or anything. So my wife and I, this was a second house of ours. We'd go up and we stayed by ourselves. We always mentioned, yep, the ghost was there, but we never felt threatened or we never felt uncomfortable staying there by ourselves. So it was really interesting.
So did you guys ever actually see anything, like see any kind of entity or?
Yeah, just always out of the corner of your eye. It was kind of the classic a dark figure that looked like a person moving. The big place you always would see it would be on the other side of a door frame, which I always thought there was something to that, but I could never quite figure it out. The way the house set up, you went in and you kind of had a main room, and then behind that was a kitchen, and there was no real divider. You stepped down into the kitchen, but there wasn't a door or anything. And then to your left was kind of like the sitting room, and it was always to that door on the left. And then there was a bedroom back around there too, and you'd always see something in that room moving. Not always, but you catch it out of the corner of your eye. And then stuff in the kitchen would absolutely move. A lot of stuff would fall off the cabinets, the counters, and get moved around, but nothing scary. Like never like at 2 a.m. where all of a sudden like crash, boom, or anything like that. It was just always weird, mischievous type stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because as my listeners on my show know, my house is haunted. I have, I believe, at least the couple that built the house living here still, and it could be more than that. We're actually bringing someone in November to help cleanse the house because it's getting creepier.
Is it?
But yeah, one of them likes to apparently stroke my wife's hair, and likes to touch her shoulder. So it gets as far as it's gone so far, but I don't want it to go any.
Yeah.
And my 5-year-old daughter's room is always very cold when you go
Yeah.
in, like colder than the rest of the house, which kind of creeps me out because I'm like, why are they chilling in the room of a 5-year-old girl? Like that's kind of creepy.
Well, you're the expert on this. I mean, I actually know some about it. This is a fun topic, and I've like I watched Ghost Adventures. I started on Ghost Hunters until they kind of got called out. So I mean, I know the pop paranormal theories on all of that stuff. And I mean, the Ghost Adventures theory is if it's in a kid's room, it might not be good.
Yeah, that's kind of my theory too, because I
Yeah.
swear to God, when we first moved in and my daughter was asleep, like I would see creepy shadow movements on the wall that I didn't
Yeah.
want to see, and I was just like, that stopped. I don't know why, but that stopped. And now it's just like I don't know. I just want my house to be cleansed so that hopefully you can get this person can help them move on. And this person was actually on my show a few episodes ago. Her episode hasn't been released yet either, but I'm very behind on releasing episodes. I have a lot of backlog, but
It's good though.
but
It's good problem.
oh, it's a good problem to have, but I'm the one who's got to edit them all, so that's the other part of the problem. But so enough about me. But so yeah, I mean, living in a haunted house, like I don't know what to think either. Like, and the point I was getting to is we originally had like 5 remote TV remotes in this house because we have a bunch of Roku TVs, so we
Yep.
had 5 remotes. We are down to 1 remote for all the Roku TVs, and I don't know where they went. I've cleaned every room in this house looking for them, and they don't seem to be anywhere. I've cleaned every room in this house from top to bottom, searching for them. And I look all around our yard because sometimes my daughter likes to take things outside with her
Yeah.
and forget that she took them.
Yeah.
And I can't find them. I'm missing at least 3 remotes. 3 remotes are missing right now. Yeah, so it's just annoying.
Well,
I mean,
I'm a big Roku guy. I've had since the very first Roku that just happened to be the one I picked, and without the remote, those things are hopeless.
I have an app on my phone, but
okay.
because my TV because the one in my bedroom is not on and there's no button on the side to push it on,
Yeah.
I can't connect. I can't actually. I even turned it on with my daughter's remote that she has, and I can't connect to it. So it's the damnedest thing. I just can't figure it out, and I'm hoping the remotes are somewhere, and I just find them eventually. I don't want to have to buy new ones. Ugh.
I'm sure they're somewhere. My experience with the paranormal is it doesn't make stuff disappear. It'll move stuff, but it doesn't make it just vanish completely. Other than socks, I guess, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah, those are the underpants gnomes. But
right.
But so let's talk about any other experiences in your life before we move on. Should I say?
Well, let's get to it. Let's get to Atlantis, right? That's the interesting thing. My life, I don't know how interesting it is, but Atlantis is pretty interesting.
Yes, it is. Which I've talked about Atlantis here and there in this show once in a while. Like, especially if we're talking about mythology, I would bring it up. But I mean, because we all know it dates back to Greek mythology, and I believe it was even Socrates, I want to say, or Plato. Plato wrote that Atlantis and Greece went to war at one point, supposedly.
Yeah,
so
very much.
Which I mean, and so I'm no expert on any subject, though. I did want to say that because you said I'm an expert. I'm like, I am not an expert in any subject. I just like to listen to a lot and read a lot. So,
after the next 40 minutes, you're going to be an expert on Atlantis.
I'm all for that. I'm all for that.
Yeah. I mean, so do you want me to set it up for you?
Well, why don't you tell us first what made you want to get into Atlantis and what made you want to research it?
Sure. So, growing up, I was a nerd. No two ways about it. Still am, obviously. But yeah, and I grew up. Just a hint, I'm a kind of an old guy, so I grew up. I was born in the '60s, but I kind of grew up in the '70s and the '80s. And unlike today, you had TV shows, but you only had the 3 or 4 networks, and eventually there was a local cable channel, and there were books. So it's like today, if you're interested in Atlantis, you just go to YouTube and type in Atlantis, and you've got 6 weeks worth of videos. For me growing up, that wasn't the case. So looks like I've lost you. Hello.
Oh, go ahead, keep going. I'm listening. I just had to do something real fast.
Okay, no worries. Okay, yeah. So anyway, it was just one of those things where there was content to it, and I read all the books. I read "Chariots of the Gods" by Eric von Daniken. I watched all the shows, that were around during that time, and it just was interesting. I kind of ran through the material and ran out of stuff, ran out of the the entertainment level to it in the 80s. So I switched over, and as I graduated high school, I started reading a lot of the classic Greek literature, just because that's where Atlantis takes you, and you can only listen to what other people have tell you about when they read it for so long. So you wind up, when you do that, you wind up in 2 of the Platonic dialogues, something called Critias and something called Timaeus, which are the 2 dialogues where Plato talks about it. But you also end up with a lot of what they call the classical Greek literature. So I've read Herodotus, I've read a variety of plays, and Herodotus wrote this thing called the Histories. And so I knew a lot about that stuff. And then I had listened to all the paranormal is the new paranormal shows that I possibly could. In earlier this year, and so YouTube handed me this video by this guy named Jimmy Corsetti on a channel called Bright Insight, and it was a documentary about Atlantis. I hadn't thought about Atlantis for decades. When I watched this, about 8 months ago, and this guy Jimmy, he thought he had found it, and then he laid his case out, and I was really intrigued by it because I thought there was something there. Now, because I had done a lot of my own research and I had read all the what they call the primary or the source material, I thought his explanations were pretty good, but he missed a few things. I thought that he misinterpreted some things, so I wanted to jump in on my own and see if I could independently verify kind of his findings, and sure enough, I did. And the result of that was this book that I've written called Atlantis Solved: The Final Definitive Proof, because it is very definitive when you go through it. The place has been found. We now know where it is, and the question we have now is, now that we know where it is, now what? What do we do with that knowledge?
Where did he think it was? That's my curiosity right now.
Yeah, so it turns out that the city of Atlantis is in the middle of the Sahara Desert, which is kind of a fun place for it to end up. And it's actually in the Western Sahara in a country called Mauritania, which is right below, it's south of Morocco. And when you look at a map, when you're looking at the big swoop of Africa on the western side that goes out into the Atlantic Ocean, pretty much that whole country is Mauritania. And then this location is a couple hundred miles inland, which we can talk about, which is really interesting because everyone thinks Atlantis sunk into the sea, which isn't actually what Plato says. But when you look at it, it looks like Atlantis. It looks like the city. It's got a center landmass, and it's got what would have been alternating rings of land and water. It was in a climate that had a lot of rainfall. And it meets to get what Plato's description of Atlantis is, which is our primary source for Atlantis. It meets at like over 99%. So, I mean, it really nails all the features he gives that could be measured can be found in this Rishat structure in the Western Sahara.
Which is completely opposite of where everybody else always thought it was. Everybody else always assumed Atlantis sunk into the ocean. I mean, Futurama even did a great parody episode about Atlantis sinking into the ocean.
Yeah, no, and here's the cool thing about it. Well, the interesting thing is this particular structure, this Rishat structure, it can only be seen from the air. Not like the Nazca lines, not like they built it so it could only be seen from the air, but it's so big when you're on the ground, you don't pick up on the fact that these are concentric circles that go all the way around. You don't pick up on the structure. So it was actually first identified, I think, the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It might have even been before NASA. Whatever was before NASA when they started working on the space program. Whatever that was, but it was pretty quickly, it became NASA. But anyway, it's such a unique landmass that the early satellite shots and the early manned programs used this Rishat structure as a visual landmark, so they knew where they were when they came around the Earth, and then they could see this, and they knew that it was a couple hundred miles to the Atlantic Ocean. And they knew where they were, so they used it from a positioning standpoint. But yeah, so it's only been known since the 60s.
And no one else ever tied this to Atlantis before. That's why I find it interesting.
Well, a lot of people started to. So I originally thought Jimmy was like the first one to break the news. His videos came out in 2018. But then I dug into it, and it's been kind of I found like a couple local news channels that jokingly said it looked like Atlantis. And there's this other guy, David Stig Hansen, who's actually there right now. So we actually have a number of things going on. But David Hansen, he had been there about a year ago because he wanted to look at it, and he's back there right now. There's a number of tests we're running. There's a couple different areas we found where we think we can bring back and do some chemical analysis. And I can explain why chemical analysis is the right thing to do. Yeah, so it's just it had to be put together, and it had to kind of catch fire. It had, without the internet and the ability to go viral and all that stuff, I don't think the word would be out, because it was only YouTube and the nature of the ability to communicate this that kind of allowed it to work its way into, the social consciousness, just so like I could find it. I wouldn't have found it without YouTube. So it's all very modern, all very new is a phenomenon that's helping us here.
So Atlantis, what do we still think that? Does he still believe that they're like we're a highly scientific race, like that we're advanced beyond us, even like at that point?
No.
No,
no,
yes.
no. So I'm like the Grinch who stole Christmas. All right. I'm going to tell you, look, Christmas is going to happen. You've got all the presents lined up, and we're all, Atlantis is like those presents with the wrapping paper on it, right? It could be anything. The challenge is just like, when I was a kid, anything I got at Christmas time. So if I needed a new pair of tube socks, they'd show up at Christmas time. So what's in, what was in my Christmas packages weren't near as excited as the wrapping paper around them. But that's the same thing we have here. So when we use that term advanced, especially when Plato says advanced, or when we're talking about the time period, which we can get into, which is 9600 BC, by the way, is when Atlantis was destroyed. I can tell you how we get to that date. There's a couple of different ways to get there. But what they were very advanced at was they were very good at agriculture, way more so than the Greeks of the time, or Proto-Greece, or whatever was going on, around the Mediterranean, 9600 BCE. And they were also the first society we have any account of that organized themselves in a very interesting way. What they did is they said Atlantis, it had 10 provinces. It had the capital, which was ruled by King Atlas, and that name is very important. And then it had 9 provinces all over the place, all over the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean and everything. And those were ruled by princes, but they invented NATO. So what they said is, for all these kingdoms, all these provinces, we have a rule, and the rule is we can't go to war with each other. We don't fight each other, and if anyone attacks any of our provinces, then all of the provinces, all the kingdoms respond. And those are the ways they were advanced. They were very advanced socially, which Plato liked. That's why he picked them. He loves trying to give examples of ideas that he has. And then they were very advanced agriculturally. And we have the historical evidence to support this. The timing is perfect for those two types of advancements.
Which, yeah, it is, because at that point, the Greeks were constantly fighting the Trojans, the Romans, and everybody else, and the Egyptians. But
yeah, the Greeks were good at war. Now, we're talking 9600 BCE, which means that just before what we know as Greek, or even classical Greek, this would be what we would call the Proto-Greeks. This would be whatever the civilization was that was present in Greece that preceded the Mycenaeans. But yeah, the Greeks are good at war. And when we know the Atlanteans, for all they were good at, they weren't better than these Proto-Greeks at war, because the Greeks beat them back. The Atlanteans, Plato tells us that the Atlanteans invaded Libya, and as far as Egypt, and the northern parts of, or the southern parts of Europe, which is the northern part of the Mediterranean, all the way inward to Greece. So they invaded all that, but when they got to Greece itself, the story is that the Greeks were like, nope. And then a big war ensued, and they fought them all the way back to their capital, which is when the disaster happened.
which, yeah, makes sense. And we'll get into the disaster in a second. But one of my co-hosts from my other show actually has a question. What are the odds of the high-risk status of Mauritania and an attempt to hide these Atlantean structures from the public?
I think that's part of it. So we deal, in order for David, who's there, he is the lead on this. I don't want to make it sound like, since I know what he's doing, I was more involved, although I am helping with some of the funding and I've been involved in the planning. But when you go to Mauritania, you have to negotiate your way in through the government. Matter of fact, we actually were dealing with the president of Mauritania's office to get permission to do some of the things we wanted to do. And this place, I mean, it's the Sahara Desert. So there are towns and there is infrastructure and all that, but it's not like, I live in Florida. There's not a mall you go to. It's not nice like here, and they are very protective of the area. I don't want to say secretive. Because that's not exactly right. They're very protective, and a lot of that protection comes not from a national strategy, to choose my words very carefully. It comes from the fact that since Jimmy Corsetti's video kind of broke about 4 years ago, there's a tourist industry now for this thing. So they're managing it as a tourist attraction versus an academic discovery, or like what this question suggests, something that would be hidden. They don't want to hide it necessarily, but they've created such a bureaucracy around getting to it that it's almost the same effect. Because I mean, they have an in the country you're not allowed to fly a drone, for example. They have a law. Now you can still do it, but you got to get through like 6 different custom checkpoints. And if they find any of the things you're not allowed to have, they'll take it. So what we had to do, I mean, we had to put in, we had to send multiple drones, and we have to send other items like a big Bowie hunting knife. So maybe we can get them to take the Bowie hunting knife and not keep going through the bags to find the other stuff. And the same thing, getting it out. And getting it out, you got to be more careful, because it's like, if we don't get permission to take like a sand sample, we can't have Dave stuck, in an Islamic country going to jail because he's trying to steal part of it or something. So there's all kinds of layers that you have to be really careful. So I don't think they're actively trying to hide it. I think just the nature of the land around it and the structure of things keep it hidden, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I mean, but what makes me think about it, though, is, do we think there's actually, like, if someone did an ancestry test, could there possibly be like Atlantean DNA still coursing through some blood nowadays?
It's a good question. So, I've actually, and that comes up. So the DNA helps us and it confuses us when it comes to this location being Atlantis. It helps us in that the general philosophical academic overlay for people is that all of our DNA originates out of Africa. It's a common, well-known thing. Now, there's lots of layers to that. But my argument has always been, well, if that's the case, why is it so hard for people to accept that early advanced civilizations also can be found in Africa, right? Because if that's where we all came from, that means that's when they fired the gun to start the race, that's where we all were. So there's a lot of, I think that provides us a lot of emphasis on this location. But then you have the other side of that, which is to interpret DNA, you have to reverse engineer it, right? So you don't start with a location and then find people that have DNA from that location. You find people and you find what DNA they have, what theories do we have about the location of where the type of DNA comes from, and you got to kind of work it backwards. So every person on the planet, as far as I know, including me, because I had a DNA test, although I regret having had it done because now those records are out there, but I had a very small percentage of DNA from West Africa. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was Atlantis, because that's an interpretation made by the people that evaluated the DNA on where similar DNA came from versus like actual geography. So I think DNA helps. I think the DNA tests are confusing at best, although all DNA points back to Africa, and that's where this place is. So you really can use it any way you want to argue it, I guess, would be the way I'd answer it.
Which makes sense. I mean, I actually had an ancestry test done a couple years ago. Well, actually, like 4 or 5 years ago now. But yeah, and it actually led to me finding who my donor father was.
Okay,
and a bunch of half sisters and brothers, but. So it led to some very interesting results, but I did have a small percentage of Arabian blood, yeah. I think they called it, like, so around that area, kind of. Yeah. But so
I think most people do, and I've dug into it to see if there was anything there, and there's different letter designations they give, and they can trace them around. I don't think it helps us with Atlantis. I've tried to stay very focused on just the Atlantis stuff. So the DNA doesn't lead anywhere when it comes to this question.
Which, of course, it makes sense that you would want to do that. I mean, yeah. Eventually, once more and more stuff's discovered, then maybe. I mean, are you guys eventually going to attempt like a dig or like a archaeological site?
If I were Elon Musk or had unlimited money, then yes. But I'm not, and Dave isn't either. So we're shooting our financial wad, and he's fitting the bill for most of it to get him there a second time, because we've identified a lot of locations that are interesting. Instead, what we're going to do, the end of this journey, the end of this phase of the journey for us seems to be, he's there. We're collecting tons of footage. We've got the book written and it's been copyrighted. We're working on putting a documentary together. It'll probably be on Goya. GAIA will probably be the distributors for it. It'll probably be 2, 3, 4, 5 episodes, but it's just going to lay out the whole journey and make the whole case. And unlike every other, documentary on Atlantis has ever happened, we're not going to end with, and it could be one of these three places and we don't know, we had a good time. We're going to show you exactly where the proof is and where to dig. We know where to dig, and it's not where this Rishat structure is. And I don't want to go into the whole thing because that's what that's the whole twist of the documentary is. We found it. We know where to dig. It's close. It's close by, and a person could read Plato and figure it out just like we have. But yeah, so in June we'll put a map up with an arrow that says dig here, but I'm not going to try and fund that because I just don't have the means to fund it.
Have you thought about reaching out for funding to someone like Elon Musk who might be willing to?
It's in my head. I think I thought I was hopeful that the book would be enough credibility to approach someone like that. But it's not. There's a lot of books, and this is a kooky subject, and people can't they can't digest a book in the same way they used to. So I'm hopeful that the documentary is the thing that opens doors, like opens the door to Joe Rogan, opens the door to Elon Musk, where we can make the case to put some money together and go start digging holes. And because we found it, I mean, because I know what the stuff is, and I don't know what I don't know what the implications of what we find is going to be. That's the whole point. But the whole point of this is to push human history back and establish that 9600 date, which is the end of the last ice age and the end of what they call the Younger Dryas, and that was the end of the last set of civilizations on the planet. And then something bad happened, and then it all kind of started over again. And then 500-600 years later, we get the Greek Renaissance, and at least in Western culture, and then we kind of fire it all back up with the Bronze Age and all that stuff.
Which, when do you think the actual destruction of Atlantis was? Was it during that part, or?
It was 9600 BCE. Dead on. So and that's an incredibly important date. That date comes from Plato, and the way we get to that date is Plato is recording. Most of this comes out in one of the dialogues called Critias, and it's where this fellow named Critias is talking in a group, and Plato is recording what they're saying, and he brings up Atlantis as a real piece of history. They go out of their way to say they believe it's real. And then they talk about, what the implications were. What was your question? I forgot your question.
I was asked if you knew the date.
The date. Yeah, the date. So anyway, so Critias he has a document. He has a scroll, which is what his great-great-great-great-grandfather wrote on when he went to Egypt. And his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was named Solon, Solon. And he was arguably the Greek that invented democracy. More complicated that, but the earliest idea of Athenian democracy you can get to is the Solon guy, and he was trying to figure it all out. So he went to Egypt, talked about lots of things because they're an established superpower at the time. One of the things they went over was the Egyptian history, and that's when they got to Atlantis. And they said that it happened 9,000 years before. So they were telling Solon about it, and Solon was in 600 BCE, which is about 150 years ish before Plato. So you take 600 BCE and add 9,000, you get 9600 BCE, which is an incredibly important date. It might be the most important date in recent archaeology and geography on the planet, because it's exactly the end of the last ice age, and an event called the Younger Dryas. So there were three Dryases: Younger Dryas, the Older Dryas, and the Oldest Dryas. Now, I'm not the one naming these things. I don't know. I guess they didn't want to work too hard on it. And they go back in time. Each one lasted 1,000 or 2,000 years, and each one was like an ice age. And during an ice age, what happens is the water on the planet, mostly the ocean, evaporates and becomes, rain and precipitation, all that. And then when it comes back down, some of it goes to the North and the South Pole, and it freezes. So over time, the poles, they get bigger, and there's less water in the ocean, so the water goes down a little bit, and the poles get bigger. And when they get bigger, now they get heavier. So there was a theory that was proposed in the 60s that, well, maybe they get so heavy that the ice shifts out to the poles, because that's what a regular ball would. That's what physics says should happen. Yeah. And that could be it. That could be what happened. Or some people think maybe a comet flew by, and then there was a string of pearls trail where there was lots of impacts into the ocean that caused like tsunamis. Don't know. Something big happened. It could be an earthquake. But the Younger Dryas at the end of the last ice age, it's accepted science that within the course of about a year, the temperature on the planet increased 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and all of the ice and these massive ice caps melted. Now, some theories suggest they maybe melted in a day or two. Other ones say maybe a year. But remember, this isn't a water up from melting ice problem. It's a if the ice is melting all in a day or even over the course of a year, all that weight is shifting over the planet because it's heavy, so it's heavy on the
Yeah.
poles, and then as it melts, it gets lighter, but then the water goes out into the ocean, so it's the weight is distributing, and you have this North Atlantic, well, the Atlantic, not North Atlantic, the Atlantic Ridge, which sits basically halfway between like Africa and South America and Europe and the U.S. It's very thin, some of the thinnest land on the planet. And a very easy explanation for a tsunami at this time would just be that everything that we know happened, and the weight shifted, and it did one of these, which is how you get tsunamis, and this was a big one, and it sent the tsunami over the coast of West Africa. Now, you would need a tsunami of about 1,500 feet high, which sounds terribly high, but just Jeremy, in your my lifetime, they've recorded tsunamis of like 1,700 feet high. So that's just in our lifetime. Yeah. It could be much higher. Now, we found non-fossilized whale bones dating back about 10,000 years in the Sahara Desert. Well, how would a whale get 400 miles or 300 miles inland? The only explanation is a tsunami-like event, and these aren't fossilized. This isn't when Africa was the bottom of the ocean a million years ago. This is current stuff. So that's the date, 9600 BCE. And what was going on the planet in 9600 BCE? We were hip deep in what they call the pre-pottery Neolithic, which, to break that word down, pre-pottery, it is what it is, right? So it means before pottery in our culture. And what that means, pottery is just, we figured out we could get dirt wet and cook it, and then it kind of held its form, right? That's pottery. So this is before that, and it's the Neolithic, which just means neo and lithic. So neo means new, and lithic is stone. So it's just the new Stone Age, not to be confused with, I think it's called the Mesolithic or something like that.
Yeah.
And the Paleolithic, which is the middle Stone Age and the old Stone Age. So we're hip deep in that. We're also hip deep in what they call the Neolithic Revolution. So what we're seeing, this is the first time in history. It starts about 10,000 BC, so about 400 years before the destruction of Atlantis. We see the transition from hunter-gatherer to stable agricultural societies. Hugely important. And the fact that Plato tied not just the end of the last ice age to this destruction date, but he also, of the two things he says they were good at, one of them was agriculture. And we see agriculture in the Mediterranean forming at this time. So it makes complete sense they'd be good at it. Now, we also know that the Sahara Desert, which is a desert, it's 140 degrees there right now, but during this time, 9600 BC, it was what's known as the Green Sahara. And it was like the Brazilian rainforest. That's not the right example. It was like I don't know, like Florida, where I am. So it's not quite as dense as a rainforest, but it was very fertile, ample rain, lakes, rivers. It was just a wonderful place to live. So we have agriculture. So we have all these things, and they all tie into supporting the idea of this place being Atlantis, and that time period works perfectly. If he had picked any other time period, it'd be near impossible to check all the boxes and have it make logical sense. But he picked the right time period.
Yeah, which makes sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've heard before that Sahara used to be like basically almost like a jungle, but not quite, like kind of like a wetland. Was kind of
like a wetland. Yeah, matter of fact, and amazing, especially in this part of it, an incredible amount of rivers and lakes. And I mean, Florida is the best example I can give. Because you drive around Florida, there's there's ponds, lakes everywhere, and it would have been just like that. Matter of fact, we're on about the same longitude. Is it longitude? I always get them confused. We're on the one that goes this way. Florida is about the same place on the planet as this Rishat structure is in Africa, up and down.
Yeah, which I'm trying to think, because Sahara, if I'm not mistaken, is south of Egypt, right? Like, kind of.
It is. Yes, it is. There's lots of desert south. We are way west of that. So we are south of Morocco and south of Libya. obviously Mauritania, and then inland Chad is one of the countries that's in there. That would have been one of the eastern borders of Atlantis. But it's just, so we're talking about what they call the Western Sahara.
Okay, so Western Sahara would be towards the coast,
So
obviously,
yeah,
and
way towards, and Africa's big, but yeah, so towards the coast.
which makes you wonder, like, what kind of makes you wonder if they had any animals that we never even heard of that lived in that like
Sure. Oh,
part
I
of the
think
world.
so. I think so. Plato mentions elephants, which are still, this whole area is north of the Ivory Coast, and of course it's desert now, but it's there are still elephants in the area, but it's very well known for elephants, which he mentions, and then there's other source material that points to lots of elephants around Atlantis.
Which makes sense. Makes sense. So, trying to think of
Well, so do you want
so
to know all the things that line up that he said and how it matches?
yes, because I mean I used to read this stuff like a long time ago in college, but it's been a long time since I read any Plato or Socrates or any of that Greek.
Sure.
Greek
All right. So just I've got my notes here. All right. So let's just go through everything he says. And so let's say, so who was Plato? So where does this information come from? Let's talk about that. So we've mentioned Plato a couple of times. He was a Greek, what we would call a philosopher. He would not have seen himself as a philosopher. He actually started the first college, the first university called the Academy. I don't know if he would have seen himself as an educator either. He was more, I view him like a street reporter. So he's documenting conversations, and he's trying to figure out in the world he lives in. He's trying to figure out, since society has advanced, what the best way to set up a city state or a society might be. What do the rulers look like? What do the citizens look like? What do people need to know? What's a good way to do it? What's a bad way to do it? All that kind of stuff. And in the dialogue Critias, he's taking Atlantis as an example, because I mentioned the NATO thing where they had a really good way of organizing and protecting their, keeping their friends safe, and he liked that. So he was focused on that. But he rattles off all kinds of things that can be measured. So let's see what they are. So the first, he mentions that the climate has to support the climate of the soil has to support agriculture, like we talked about. Well, the green Sahara does that. He mentions precious metals. He mentions that in Atlantis there's a orichalcum. It's a weird word. We don't know what it is.
Or it's funny because I play the Assassin's Creed video game series.
Okay,
and,
yeah.
And in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, it's all about ancient Greece. And one of the extra content you can get after the game was over was the Atlantis saga.
Yeah,
and
that would be orichalcum.
And one of the things you have to collect in that game and the next one is orichalcum. It just randomly appears magically all over the map. But
yeah. No, that is a direct straight line from Plato talking about Atlantis, and it's not mentioned anywhere else. That's the only place this thing comes from. Now we think that it might have been like a bronze gold mixture. Some people think it might have been like platinum. No one knows. But Mauritania, its primary export is precious metals. So we're in an area that mines precious metals. Plato mentions precious metals. He mentioned that the Atlanteans conquered Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe. It basically as far as Greece. He uses a term tetrahedron or some term like that, which we can kind of guess where it is. Probably Italy-ish or Malta in there. In order for the Atlanteans to want to conquer someplace, they have to be geographically related to it. So the other thing, Jeremy, make sure we talk about all the other places people think might be Atlantis and whether they fit what he said or not. But like people, they like the Azore Islands, and they like Antarctica. People like Antarctica for being Atlantis. And I'm not saying there could have been advanced civilizations on there, but if you're living in Antarctica, are you really going to sail 3,800 miles to go attack Libya? Why would you even care what's going on? No. So the capital of Atlantis has to have a geographic proximity to Libya, Egypt, Greece, and Europe. It just has, because that's who they're interacting with. Plato tells us that the continent, the landmass it was on, is over 1 million square miles. He says it's bigger than Libya and Asia Minor put together. And Libya is just kind of everything from Egypt up to the Atlas Mountains and then inland some in Africa. There's a couple other countries there now, but it's just basically that part of Africa. When you put those two geographies together, it adds up to about 1 million square miles. So things like the Azores or Santorini or the Bimini in Florida, they're not big enough to be that. When you measure where the mountain range is in the Western Africa, West Africa and Mauritania and all of that, you get a landmass that fits his description of about 2 million square miles. So by God, West Africa as a continent is bigger than Libya and Asia put together. It's the only place on the planet that solves for that has any kind of geographic proximity to Egypt and Greece and all these places. He tells us that there were very impressive mountains to the north, but the mountains to the east weren't that impressive. And that's exactly what we find in this location in Africa. We have the Atlas Mountains, which are mountains to the north, bear the name of the king, King Atlas. King Atlas was the king of Atlantis. And in Morocco, these mountains still have his name. And then when you get into Chad and the inner part of West Africa, you have lower lying, not as impressive mountains. But there's still a barrier to a continent in the same way that the mountains that separate Europe and Asia today. Those are we consider those two different continents. And it's because of the mountains. They're inaccessible and they're separated by great distances. Now, you can argue tectonic plates and all this other stuff, but Plato didn't know anything about that. I mean,
that's fairly recent developments,
right? So it fits that. He mentions that the structures were built of red, white, and black stone. All of the stone in Mauritania and around this Richat structure is red, white, and black stone. So it fits that description. He mentions the classic thing we all know. He mentioned there was a center island surrounded by alternating rings of water and land. And if anyone listen to this, Google Richat, Richat, and you'll get pictures of it because I didn't invent this. I just finished solving for it. But this place is the only place. It looks like Atlantis. It meets that description. It has a center island and alternating lands of land and what would have been underwater, because with the rain coming down, this is when would have been basically in the middle of a big lake. So that's pretty huge. Then here's a requirement, and I usually read this one because we've never heard this. This has never been culturalized or modernized. But here's something he tells us about Atlantis. He says that the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain itself, surrounded by mountains, which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even and of an oblong shape, extending in the one direction, 3,000 stadia. Well, what does that mean? So let's unpack that. So what's a stadia? Start with that. That's the unit of measure that he uses in this thing. Plato was writing during Alexander the Great's life, and the classic, the best definition of a stadia is what's called the Alexandrian measure, which is 607 feet. Okay, so if a stadia is 607 feet, we'll use that and see if it fits. It does fit, by the way. So 3,000 of those things. Well, how far is that? Well, if you multiply 3,000 times 607 and divide it by 5,280 or 820, whatever a mile is, what you get is 345 miles. So he's telling us right here that this thing was 345 miles, accessible by boats, but 345 miles inland off a plain that gently sloped to the sea. Okay, well, so then you look at the Richat structure. Well, guess how far from the ocean it is? 345 miles. It matches. No, it matches. It matches. And there's no there's no landmass you can find where you can go 345 miles and see there was a waterway, which in the book I go over all the visual evidence, and there's a lot of visual evidence what you're looking for. But it's the only place. It looks like Atlantis, and it's the correct distance from the water. Now, one of the questions I get is, but you said the sea levels were lower, so wouldn't that affect the measurement? And actually, it would affect the measurement. I have this in the documentary we're doing. We have some noted scholars on all kinds of things. One of them is on Africa. But what happens is when you get all that rain and the water is going down a river, because that's how water works and it's going to the sea, you get like what we have with like the Mississippi, let's say. There's lots of examples, or the Nile in Egypt. And then when it comes to the water, you get what they call, you get a delta. Okay. Well, that delta brings the water inland, and it happens. It just the math just happens to work so that when you look where the continental shelf is, and you add the delta in, it's about where the ocean is today. So in other words, so the measurement works. And if it's off like 1 or 2%, so it doesn't really affect the percentage. So if it's not 100%, it's like 98%, which is still enough for what we're doing. So that's hugely important. And this is the only place on the planet that does that. But there's a lot more things that Plato says that the Rishat lines up to. One of the things he tells us is that the Atlanteans had to dig a canal from the outer ring to the inner ring, which had an inner harbor, that's where the palace was, where the king lived on the inside. And he says that canal they dug, it was 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 50 stadia long. Okay. Well, if we use our stadia calculation, what that's giving us, the length of it, 50, which if you multiply that times 607, do all the math, it comes out to 5.8 miles. Well, that's the radius of this landmass, right? That's the radius from the inner island to the outer ring. So when you look at the Rishat structure and you measure it, it's 5.8 miles from the inner ring, from the inside to the outside. So the radius fits, and there is what is clearly would have been, if you added water to this thing, a big round inner harbor. So the inside of the structure even fits. And it explains, because the center island is supposed to be pretty small, like 5 stadia across or something like that. So this harbor is what allows that math to work. So it's really quite amazing. The other thing Plato tells us is that Atlantis, the city of Atlantis, had mountains to the north and was open to the south. Well, when you look at the Rishat structure, sure enough, it's got mountains to the north and it's open to the south. He tells us that it had hot and cold running springs. Well, people think this thing was a volcanic dome. And as soon as you introduce a volcano, you now have hot and cold water, right? Because we get those types of springs. So, yeah. Plato mentions elephants. And I mentioned this area was well known for elephants. And you add in the climate differences for 10,000 years ago, and it would have been ripe with elephants. Green mountains. We have the Atlas Mountains. They're very green mountains. That all fits. He mentions that it's outside what he calls the Pillars of Heracles, which we today view as the Strait of Gibraltar, right? Yes. And when you look at a map, if you take your Google map eyes off of it and you allow the Earth to look like you would look to a sailor, this thing is directly out. It's directly, you come out the Strait of Gibraltar, you follow the coast of Africa, which is how boats worked in this time period. We're talking, these are not huge sailing ships, even though they might be seaworthy. So if you could sail and get where you're going without losing sight of land, that's how they did it. And that's historically proven. We know that's the case. So you do that here, you wind up exactly where the entrance to Atlantis would have been. Now, and then the last thing I find is that he says, Critias says that the Egyptian priest said that Atlantis was on the way to the opposite continent, which is hugely interesting, because this means in 600 BCE, etched somewhere in a wall in Egypt was knowledge of the opposite continent, which we think of as North America. They were actually talking about South America, but this whole new world was known, and they wrote it down. It's in Plato. You can read it. They're talking about Atlantis being on the way to the opposite continent, and he's writing this stuff in 400 BC. The interesting thing, so I was like, well, how do I test that? So I looked, I said, well, the only real test we have, the only recorded event we have where someone tried to traverse the ocean and not know what was on the other side was Columbus. So I'm like, okay, well, how did Columbus get to the New World? What routes did he took? What did he take?
Well, I mean,
they're not documented. That's not documented.
True.
I don't dispute. I believe Vikings. I believe it goes back hundreds of thousands of years. But the only documented account that we have right now is Columbus. It just is. We don't have the documentation on the Vikings. We can prove the Vikings. We can find where they probably lived and find anecdotal pieces and stories that look like they're talking about it. But Columbus just basically said, he wrote in his journal, day one, okay, I'm trying to find, the New World. We left Spain, and then we did this. And what they do is they go down to the Canary Islands, and then they try and go across much farther south, but they find they're out of the currents, which is why their first trip was a disaster. Remember, it took them like 10 weeks, and they were rioting, and they were gonna, mutiny and all that stuff. But he actually went 4 times. The other 3 times he went, he went all the way down the coast of Africa and then across the tip, basically from the tip of Africa to the tip of South America, and he followed the currents over. You don't actually wind up that far down, but that's how the ocean works. That's how you get there. And
Yeah.
it's the exact same route that the Egyptian priests talked about on the way to the opposite continent. So, and that's it. And that's everything Plato said. There's anecdotal things he said and things that can't be measured, but as far as things that are measurable or observable and meaningful, that's it. That's the list. It's like 22 items, and this place checks every single box.
Wow. I mean, I'm still trying to process all that, but it actually makes sense to me. It really does. And
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
as far as people have been, yeah, I'm with you. There's no documented proof of it, but I believe that North America was obviously founded a long time ago because there are, I mean, I believe Native Americans on the east coast of North America told tales of people coming over and passed down those legends.
I think Graham Hancock has documented it. I don't agree with everything he doesn't agree that this Rishat structure is Atlantis. He has a different world philosophy. I think he's being too narrow. He's trying to find the first time as opposed to yet just the more recent time. All that aside, his one of his latest books, America Before, I think that's what it's called. It does a really good job up until the end of just building the case that there's enough evidence that there were people here, tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and then they were not advanced. They didn't have nuclear submarines necessarily. This isn't an advanced culture he's finding, but he's finding more advanced than we give credit to, and certainly not empty. So,
Kids.
I know. I've been watching the struggle is real, as they say, right?
You have no idea. Whenever I try to do a podcast episode when they're awake, it's just they like to cause chaos for the mother. But before we do end it, though, I do want to talk about where the other places that are wrong that people have thought Atlantis is, because I always believed it was in the Mediterranean Ocean, like sunken down, like
that's what they tell you. And let's not say these other people were wrong. Let's just say they're stretching, because Plato lays it out. He said when it comes to Atlantis, there's basically three parts. There's the capital city, there's the continent, and there's the kingdom. So we talked about the capital city here. We've alluded to the continent, West Africa, and there's more we could talk about, but the case is made. But then we get to the kingdom. And I think a lot of these places that people find where they find legitimate evidence that something was going on a long time ago, before history, prehistory, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think they're wrong about something going on. I just don't, but then everyone wants to find the Atlantis. It's like, okay, well, maybe it's not the Atlantis. I always say maybe it's not Atlantis with a capital A, but maybe it's the kingdom. So here's what Plato tells us is that there were 10 provinces, kingdoms, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, provinces. The main one is the capital city ruled by King Atlas. Then the 9 others, he gives the names of the ruler, and he says that they're alternating pairs of male twins. There are 5 sets of twins. The firstborn of the first pair of twins is King Atlas, and then he lists the names of the other ones. I've always interpreted those names as in the same way that Atlas Mountains, Atlantis. That there's a linguistic history and memory in these names potentially. So when you look at them, I've identified one. Well, so here are the places that people like. They like the Azore Islands. Some people like Spain. Some people like Santorini. Some people like the Bimini, the Bimini Road, and all that, or Cuba, or the whole Caribbean, which is close to where I live. They like Crete, the Minoans, and all of that. Some people like Malta. I don't fully understand the Malta one, but some people are very passionate about it. Some people like Antarctica. Other people they like the British Isles. Maybe there's some islands that were exposed and then went underwater, all that kind of stuff. But so here's what we found. I mentioned Atlas, Atlantis. I think we can find the Canary Islands in what Plato talks about. I think we can find there's one place he mentions called Evimon, which is the name of the king, which sounds a lot like Avalon linguistically. And I've had a linguistics person look at this. So people that like the lore of King Arthur and all that stuff, Avalon, Plato gets pretty close to that. The one I like the most, he actually says it's the eldest of the 5th set of twins. The guy's name is Azores, and he's the prince of the diving islands. So it's like, okay, Well, where'd the name Azores come from the islands that we have that everyone likes as a thing? So I looked and it came, no one knows where it came from, but it's a Spanish derivative. Okay. Lots of people like Spain and they think they found agricultural work accessible by the Atlantic Ocean a couple miles inland in Spain. They're like, well, that must be Atlantis. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Plato says they conquered parts of Europe. So it took, you can't, if you live in it, you don't conquer it. So I think the Spain is part of what they conquered, and we start to see some of their technology, their agricultural technology, and we start to see some of their linguistic names like Azores sticking. So I think it's all, I think it's all laid out, and I think that all those other places fit within the kingdom of Atlantis and have their own unique story that Plato didn't document because he really focused on the capital, but he does mention them, and I think that also alludes pretty pretty well to the idea of this global maritime empire. You know, people could get around.
Yeah.
And I think we find that in the dialogues.
Interesting. So, yeah. I mean, it's funny because Atlantis has been talked about in modern culture since at least the, I want to say 50s. Like,
oh yeah,
that's when people really started like
longer,
talking about it.
Yeah.
Well, longer, but that's when I think it's when it became like common knowledge that
Yeah,
the myth of the legend of Atlantis.
Yeah,
at least to modern culture. But so I mean, it's interesting, and I look forward to watching your documentary. I really do because I'm dying to see this place, and I know I'll never go. I know I'll never travel to Africa because I can't afford to travel to another state, let alone Africa. But
well, yeah, but look, if you want the same experience, just buy like 25 heat lamps. And plug them in and stand in the middle of a summer day for like 3 days, stand under them, try and sleep under them, and it's the same exact thing.
I'm good on that.
or just imagine it if you don't want to waste the money on the travel lamps. Yeah,
I can imagine it. And God.
Yeah, but so my message is: look, it's been found, and I think people, it's a visual medium. And the other thing I do point out is this place being Atlantis and everything I've said, none of it contradicts anything. It doesn't contradict any mainstream. You always use that term mainstream like they're wrong, and they might be wrong, right, or whatever, but it doesn't contradict any of the knowledge I mentioned, the time period, the pre-pottery Neolithic. I mentioned all that stuff. I mentioned Plato. It meets everything he said, and it doesn't contradict any of it. So I think it's a unifying theory. And the question now just becomes, and then it's all visual. So everything I've said, and if you get the book or you just start reading Plato, everything, anyone can look and find the same things that I found. So like any of these other locations, someone has to explain it to you, and you have to like take this mental leap. Like for the Azores, it's like, okay, so I have to believe that 1 million square miles of land suddenly materialized out of the seabed where it doesn't exist, and then it exists. It's like, no, it doesn't work. But for Rishat, you can go look at it. And as soon as you look at it, Google it. As soon as you Google it and you see your first image, you're like, yeah, that's it. And then we lay out all the supporting stuff. So I think the documentary will be a hit because it's visual and everyone can just see it. They can go through the journey with us as we lay the whole thing out.
Exactly, which I appreciate that. And
yeah,
why don't you tell people where they can find anything about you they want to find, or where they can find your books or anything?
The publisher website is frequency99.com. 2 9s are numbers, frequency99.com. And that's got contact info, and all my books are up there, and other people's books are up there too. The teaser trailer or the teaser poster for the documentary is up there. The Atlantis book is up there. You can link to it and go crazy. Frequency99.com.
Well, I look forward to reading some of your books, and I look forward to your documentary because actually, I was looking at your books before, and I wish we had more time to get into your other books you've written. But maybe I'll have you back on at some point.
Yeah, I've written a lot. I've written 45 books. It's a lot of books.
God.
Yeah.
I can't imagine writing that many books. Someday, but
yeah, you can do it. It's just about want to,
Yeah, well, maybe. But
okay.
I want to thank you for coming on, of course, David, because you have given us all, you've proven something that no one's been able to fully prove ever. Like
that is, and that's my contribution. I didn't find this, but I proved it, and you can go, and I did it in a way that you can look at the details. It's not just you got to buy the theory or not. You can look every single step of the way, and and I tell people, look, if you find something I got wrong, even if I am wrong, it probably doesn't affect the overall percentage because I broke it down to a percentage. So let's say it goes from 99% to 97% or 92% that this place matches. Still a match,
Yeah. I mean, exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
Anyway. Yeah.
all my listeners, you know where you can find me, and I will see you all next time.